when you're talking about batteries and you want to figure out how many kilowatt hours or amp hours you have or what the capacity is, an amp hours of a battery is based on the voltage of the battery. So
Okay.
if you have a 370 amp hour battery here, that's 6 volts.
Mm-hmm.
So when you wire up the batteries, if you wire them in series, you will be increasing the voltage. So in this case, you're going to wire up 8 batteries in series, so that would be 6 times 8 is 48 volts.
Uh-huh.
So each 8 batteries makes up one string of 48 volts, and each of those strings at 48 volts is 370 amp hours. So since you have 24 batteries and they're wired in strings of 8, you divide 24 by 8 and you have 3 strings at 48 volts. So you have 370 amp hours times 3 strings of 1110 amp hours. And then you would multiply the amp hours times the voltage to figure out the kilowatt hours, which is the currency of energy that we commonly use. So that's 1110 times 48 volts is a nominal battery capacity of 53 kilowatt hours. Because these are lead acid batteries, we don't recommend that you discharge them fully because that will actually damage the batteries and reduce the lifespan of the battery. So when you're dealing with lead acid batteries, we commonly recommend a lower than 100% discharge rate. Depending on the type of use of the batteries, the depth of discharge would be adjusted accordingly. In this case, we've specified approximately 60% capacity, 60% depth of discharge. And so what it says here is that particular system you're mentioning would have approximately 32 kilowatt hours of usable capacity at 60% depth of discharge.
Got it. And that's almost a day for some homes. So you can go a day. Now, is the 60% regulated by the charge controller, or is that something that the homeowner is going to have to manage when the power fails?
It's usually set up by the installer so that you would set the default low voltage disconnect point to approximately represent the 60% depth of discharge. Unfortunately, the rate at which you discharge a battery affects its capacity. So if you discharge a battery faster, you get less amp hours. I believe the amp hour ratings are listed here at a 20-hour rate. So that means that if you were discharging those batteries in such a way that they would be completely exhausted after 20 hours, that means you would take, it would be 370 amp hours divided by 20 would be 18 amps for each string. So that would be 55 amps times 48 volts, about approximately 2,600 watts. So if your average load was a continuous 2,660 watts, you would get 370 amp hours if you discharged them 100%. And you'd get 32 kilowatt hours if you discharged them 60%. The other thing that affects the capacity of the batteries is the temperature of the batteries. So if the batteries are colder, they'll have lower capacity. If they're discharged at a faster rate than 2,600 watts, they'll also have a lesser capacity. In general, you're going to put in you're usually going to have a engine generator backup so that when the sun is at a minimum availability, like during long periods of storm activity, you're not commonly going to have adequate array to run all of the loads in the winter. So you have a engine generator that's set up with automatic settings as well to charge the batteries and run the loads when the batteries get down to whatever set points you have that programmed into. So these programming, the types of things you have to program are the rate at which how low you want the batteries to go before the generator comes on. You have to also program the charging rate so that you charge the batteries at the appropriate rate. So there's commonly a little bit of fine-tuning that goes into getting those set points set up correctly. And these batteries are flooded batteries, so there's maintenance required. sometimes when I talk to people that are first installing their first battery-based systems, I make an analogy that getting involved in this type of work is kind of like getting married to your customer, because they're completely off-grid and they're completely reliant on the equipment that you've provided them to give them power. So if they don't have power for whatever reason, you're going to be their best friend, and they're going to be trying to call you and have you come out there and get them up and running again. So, and sometimes it's most likely that that'll happen during a storm. If some set points are not correct on the starting of the generator, what have you, and these customers commonly have locations that are farther away, not in urban locations, but in more rural locations, so there's a lot more drive time involved. So with the complexity of the batteries, the set points, and the remote location, my recommendation to you is, if you're going to get involved in doing this, you have to be willing to learn a lot about the equipment, read the manuals, and some people choose to specialize in this and they do a good living, but in general you're going to want to charge certainly more than what you're used to charging for a straight grid-tied solar system. Mm-hmm. And if you're not up to the availability that your customer is likely to want for you to provide them, then that's something you should consider as well. Some of your customers are going to be more willing to learn how to maintain their systems, and usually you'll have a conversation with the client about whether or not you're going to provide the maintenance, or if they're going to learn to and provide the maintenance for their system, because there is maintenance involved as far as replacing the electrolyte in the battery with distilled water, and periodically charging the batteries to keep them up to full performance. So the replacement of batteries, the things that affect that are how deeply you discharge the batteries, how often you discharge them deeply, how soon you recharge them after they've been discharged, and what temperature the batteries are stored at. So a deeper discharges at a more frequent interval without replacing the battery power quickly and keeping them in really warm climates, those all tend to decrease the lifespan of the batteries. If the batteries are kept in a relatively cool location and they're maintained and treated correctly, they should last between 5 and 8 years for this type of battery. If they're abused, they might only last 6 months or a year. And commonly batteries don't come with extensive warranties unless you pay premium prices for the warranty. In my own personal experience is that even the extended warranties that they offer, if you look at the details of what they want, they want you to record lots of information like specific gravity of the batteries on a periodic basis, and if you don't do that, then you're not necessarily in conformity with the warranty. So honestly, what you're doing is just paying more for the same battery. There are certainly batteries out there that will offer longer terms of warranty, but basically it kind of equates to just paying more for the same battery. Some of the batteries are more robust and would command a better price, but from my perspective, like these L16s that are specified here are probably the best value for that size system. You start getting into these bigger batteries, the 6M25 that's listed there, 6M15. Those are taller forklift-style batteries, and so they're a little bit easier to maintain because there's fewer of them, but their cost is generally more expensive on a per amp-hour basis.
So anywhere between 6 months to 5 years, depending on the maintenance.
Up to 8 years. I've actually had customers that have had these systems in Northern California locations that are fairly cool, up to 10 years. But I don't commonly cite that because most people are not as good as that customer was in maintaining their batteries, and they probably are in a location that has higher temperatures, and so they would not necessarily get that longevity.
What about hydrogen gas buildup and ventilation, external separation of the equipment from the dwelling? Any recommendations for that?
Yeah, it is definitely a good idea to separate the batteries from the rest of the equipment and the generator area. So it's common for people to put off-grid systems, install them in such a way that the array is close to the inverters and the batteries, because that's the lower voltage, and you don't want a lot of voltage drop. So you might have a shed that has two sides to it, one side for the generator, and then a wall separating the generator side from the rest of the equipment, and then you have commonly either a battery box that's ventilated to the exterior, or you'll set it up in such a way that you only equalize the batteries when someone is present. You open up the door and get plenty of air circulation, so you don't worry about accumulation of hydrogen gases. So, generally, the hydrogen gassing occurs when you're doing an equalization, which is kind of a controlled overcharge, and you do that periodically. Maybe every 6 months as the batteries are new, 4 to 6 months, and then as the batteries get older, they commonly require that more frequently. And then after the batteries are completely charged, that's when you add the distilled water. So, customers should not be adding the distilled water when the batteries are discharged, because then when they become charged, the level of the electrolyte rises, and so you can get into situations where you're spilling acid. If you're replacing the electrolyte with distilled water when the batteries are low in charge. So that's kind of a rough overview. I mean, there's a lot of information out there about batteries and how to use and maintain batteries and battery-based systems, and it's just definitely more complicated than just getting into your straight grid-tied systems. Even a grid-tied system with batteries is less complicated, because you still have grid power available, so your customer is not going to be so dependent on the system. Even if the system goes down, it's usually provided there just for backup purposes, and most of the time you have grid power available. But for these guys that live off grid, if they're not the tinkerer type that installs it themselves, they either need to learn to be aware of the fact that they're living with limited resources, or they need a very adequate generator and fuel so that they can have whatever creature comforts they're used to. You kind of get two types of customers. One that just says, I want this house out in there, and I don't want to compromise my lifestyle at all. I want it to run everything I want it to whenever I want to. And those kind of people generally don't want to be hands-on, and they don't really want to know anything about what the equipment is or maintain it or anything like that. And they also don't have an active role in trying to minimize their power use, using more energy efficient lighting and equipment. Those are kind of the two types of people that you commonly find that are off-grid customers.
Well, you completely refocused my energy.
Okay. Well,
no, I kind of suspected that. That is everything I expected. We do get a lot of requests. I think it's because of the internet marketing. Here in Texas, we're in a climate zone 2, so we have a lot of temperature swings. So I was really concerned about the storage temperature of the battery, and then also the maintenance required by the owner. I mean, if the kind of person they needed to be to own this type of system. And here in Texas, we've always had cheap power. We have homes that consume a lot of power, and so now suddenly the scale of the requirement is large, so it's going to be very expensive for them to even consider going off grid. And then you combine that with required knowledge for maintenance, and it's just, I think it's just probably too much for most of my customers. We've got over 400 grid-tie wind turbines. I don't think I'm going to exclude anybody who wants to buy parts from us, but I think what I would do in the off-grid is just sell them a package, pretty much the way you put it together, and maybe go do an install for them and offer no or just probably charge them an hourly rate for the service. Another part I'm concerned about is the developed resources we're going to have on staff, and how many installs we're going to have to get behind us before this resource is proficient in determining or diagnosing what the problems are or not, and properly maintaining the systems and educating the customer. Replicating this conversation or you is the mission would have to be the mission in order to properly sell and support a off-grid system, I think.
Right. Yeah, well, at least you're taking a proactive look at this rather than just jumping into it. And you know, this is something that I usually recommend to all of our salespeople, is that they have a conversation with somebody about this certainly before they quote it. Because you know, I've seen too many people that quote these systems based on whatever dollar per watt they're used to selling the grid tie systems for, and they end up feeling pretty sorry they did that.
Oh yes, I'm sure.
You know, so that's my general recommendation. But it's nice to be able to offer this to people, but it is important to manage the customer's expectations and make clear, you know, who's responsible for what. You know, as you get involved in that type of equipment, and you commonly the sizing the inverter, you have to make sure that it's capable of starting all of the loads that they might want to start at any one time. So it has to be capable of the surge requirements. Generally speaking, I don't recommend running air conditioners on off-grid systems. If you're in Texas, I don't know how much humidity you have with your heat there.
A lot.
Yeah, and if you do, then swamp cooler type of application doesn't really help you much. That's really more useful in a drier climate. So it's just fortunately you would have a lot more power availability in the summer because you've got much longer days. And commonly when you're sizing these systems, we try and size them for the winter loads, or at least the spring and fall loads, because we want to make sure that they have enough array that the generator doesn't have to run for at least half of the year, you know, hopefully more like 9 months or 10 months, and then the generator just comes on in the winter when the days are so much shorter and they don't get the capacity. But, you know, if a big part of your loads are air conditioning and you don't have a lot of heating loads, then your lighting, of course, would be more in the winter, but your refrigeration and air conditioning loads would not be there. And depending on what type of heat you're using, you wouldn't be using electric heat or electric kitchen or anything like that either. All those customers, we always recommend they go with, say, a propane for that type of stuff. And oftentimes they have and do you guys have propane delivery out in that area?
We do.
Or is it all natural gas? Well, since they're way out in the middle of nowhere, usually it's propane. And then you just get them a generator that runs on propane, so they don't have to deal with diesel and propane.